to 1947, the year Jackie Robinson integrated, and what I like to say, initiated the dismantling of baseball's color line, we saw 53 Latinos participating in the major leagues, both foreign-born and U.S.-born Latinos. During that same period, we see over 240 Latinos participating in the Negro Leagues, in the black baseball circuits of the United States. So what we see is over a 4-to-1 ratio of participation of Latinos in the Negro Leagues. To me, that also tells us a powerful story about how we remember, and not just as a U.S. society, but among Latinos and Latin American societies, the story of race. When I grew up, I was told all about the heroes of baseball from the earliest periods. And there was Adrian, the first Puerto Rican in the major leagues. And there was no story about Mijito Navarro, the first Puerto Rican in the Negro Leagues, who came in 1928. 14 years before Adrian Bithorn, not to the Cubs, played with the Chicago Cubs. And so, in part, the story of race is not just an issue that North Americans, white Americans, African Americans have, but it's also a particular issue that we as Latino have. How we remember our past, how we talk about that past. Now, again, the powerful story to me here is of that greater participation that took place in the Negro Leagues for Latinos, that they were not perceived or received as white. They were seen as people of color, foreign, and therefore the majority were excluded from the racially segregated major leagues. But how did those players get into the major leagues, those Latinos? Who enabled them? Who brokered the access? Well, in my first book, I talked quite a bit about how it was the major league team officials, owners, scouts, team presidents, who were the ones who had the power to broker access. Because it mattered if they perceived you as not black and could present you to the public as Cuban, that you would have access. If you self-identified and said, oh, I'm Puerto Rican, it didn't matter. Unless it was Clark Griffith, the owner of the Washington Senators, says, he's not black, he's Puerto Rican. Because self-identification in terms of access into the major leagues mattered not. It was about those who were inside of the institution, who wielded the power. And they were the ones who, in fact, would enable these racially ambiguous Latinos to gain access into the league. Yet, those players and the gentleman up top, that's the best picture I can find in a hurry this morning, is Roberto Estalella. And Estalella played with the Washington Senators. He was Cuban-born. And he first appeared in 1935 and then started again in 1939 and played during World War II. And Estalella, as I'll show in a couple of slides, received a particularly difficult reception by his teammates. And those were his teammates, and I'll get into that in a moment. But the important part is how Latinos are treated by the press, by fans, by teammates, illuminates a process, and now I'm going to just drop one academic word on you, racialization. A process by which individuals are grouped together, given an assumed set of characteristics, of beliefs, and then also that group is used, or that category is used, to treat them differently from a mainstream category, or those who are in power. So, when I first started doing my research on the inclusion of Latinos, well, most people said, oh, all the Latinos who got into major leagues were white. They were accepted as white. They're in. And the story is much more complicated. If anything, what we can say is that they were seen as not black, and, in fact, what they occupied was a category which I label brown. Not fully white, not black, but able to be allowed in. Because the purpose of baseball's color line, fundamentally, was about excluding blacks. And ultimately, it became about excluding black Americans from the United States. And that's why they felt the most powerfully the impact of baseball's color line. So if we look at the politics of language, and looking at sporting newspapers, you'll see all the time, and we actually often see it today, and also hear it on sports radio, about the mocking of Spanish accents. Or, as what occurred with Sammy Sosa, when his quotes are not cleaned up, but they're allowed to come out phonetically, so that Sammy, who does a pretty good job of making himself look bad, is made to look worse. So, that's involved in the process of racialization. Because through the written word, how do you convey foreignness? How do you convey difference? You have to present it phonetically or through accented words that just doesn't read the same. In my first book, okay, this is dropping in, of academic term number 2, I call it intellectual disenfranchisement. And in that book, what I'm trying to get at is where the focus is shifted from what a person is saying to how that person is saying it, so as to make the individual appear less intelligent. And that often happens with Latinos, because that is the way we can mark them as different. Well, let's get to the story of the Cincinnati Reds. And for you Red fans, if there are any of you, condolences on getting swept or, but all that. But the Cincinnati Reds were coming up on the 100th year anniversary of their bringing in the first 2 Cubans out of Latin America. Prior to 1911, all the Cubans who had played in the major leagues had come to the United States for their education first, and were discovered, i.e. what happened to the very first player, Esteban Bellan, who played in 1868. And he was at Fordham playing college and decided to turn pro, and he ended up playing in the major leagues of his era. But this is a different story in 1911. But notice how the Cincinnati Enquirer has to introduce the first 2 Cubans to the sporting public in Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Reds were in Chicago, and the fans had yet to see these 2 players, Rafael Almeida and Armando Marsans. And so while they played their game in Cincinnati, and they had their debut over July 4th weekend, we have this article come out. Ladies and gentlemen, we have in our midst descendants of a noble Spanish race with no noble African blood to place a blot or spot on their escutcheons. Permit me to introduce to you 2 of the purest bars of Castilian soap that ever floated to these shores, Senors Almeida and Marsans. And so here we have it. And let me give you another anecdote before I break down this quote. You see, the fans were worried. The public was worried. Did the Reds just allow 2 black players into the league by presenting them as Cuban? And as the New York